Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I hope you're having a great week. If you are in the U.S. and you celebrate Thanksgiving, then I hope that your week is going well, preparations are going well. If you're spending time with family, I hope that it is wonderful and nurturing and all of those great things. If you don't celebrate, then it's maybe just another week for you. But I hope that week is going well regardless of which holiday you may or may not be celebrating this week. At any rate, I hope you also had a good weekend and that you're just, everything's going well. I, of course, am here for an author interview to share with you. This week I am doing I'll have two interviews to post. The first is with author Davida G. Breier. Her debut novel is called Sinkhole. It is suspenseful. It is psychological. I am going to go ahead and give you the description from that book. Lies from the past and a dangerous present collide when, after 15 years in exile, Michelle Miller returns to her tiny hometown in Laredo, Florida. With her mother in the hospital, she is forced to reckon with the broken relationships she left behind, with her family, with friends, and with herself. As a teenager, Michelle felt isolated and invisible until she met Sissy, a dynamic and wealthy classmate. Their sudden, intense friendship was all-consuming. Punk rocker Morrison later joins their clique, and they become an inseparable trio. They were the perfect high school friends, bound by dysfunction, bad TV, and boredom, until one of them ends up dead. Forced to confront the life she turned her back on 15 years ago, she begins questioning what was truth and what were lies. Now, at a distance, Michelle begins to see how truly dangerous Sissy was. An ingenious debut from editor and publisher Davida Breier, Sinkhole is a mesmerizing, darkly comic coming-of-age novel immersed in 1980s Central Florida. A disturbing and skillful exploration of home, friendship, selfhood, and grief set amidst golf courses, mobile homes, and alligators. Okay, that last sentence might be my favorite sentence ever. A disturbing and skillful exploration of home, friendship, selfhood, and grief set amidst golf courses, mobile homes, and alligators. That's pretty accurate, yeah. I mentioned in the interview with Davida that my sister is basically the same age as Michelle, and so she, while I am a little bit younger than my sister, so a little bit younger than the main character of this book, it was still really fun to revisit this time period, even though it's not, kind of a cheery, lighthearted novel. It was still fun to revisit some of those things that I remember from the 80s. And we do talk about that time period during the interview. This is dark. It is psychological. I mean, it takes you through some twists and turns, and you're never quite sure. I'd say I felt off balance a lot while reading this book, just never quite sure what was real and what was not, which is accurate to how the book and how a lot of the characters in the book are feeling. What is real? What is not? What is truth? What are they remembering correctly and incorrectly, etc. So you have the journey that Michelle is on in the present, as she is going back home to Florida to visit her mother in the hospital. She hasn't been home in 15 years. And then you also have her remembering on that trip the events that led up to her leaving her hometown and everything that she went through. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview. Again, the book is called Sinkhole, and the author is Davida G. Breier. Hi, Davida. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you here to talk about your book. It's called Sinkhole. But before we do that, if you could share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Sure. I'd always written and I've worked in publishing a really long time. But I decided I wanted to try my hand at fiction. And so, this is my first novel, but my background was that I grew up largely in South Florida, and that ends up becoming kind of important for the novel, and moved around a bit. But I currently work for Johns Hopkins University Press. Pretty much my job there is making sure books are sold and make it to readers. So that's kind of nice when it came to knowing what I needed to do to help my book.
Yeah, that's good background to have. And I'm laughing at myself because I was reading your author bio on, I think, Amazon, and it said, growing up in Florida. And then I misread what it said next, and I thought it said something about growing up or living in Florida, Minnesota. And I was like, wow, there's a Florida, Minnesota. And I realized it was Florida, Minnesota, and some other states.
Yeah, I moved a bit and to very disparate places as a kid.
Yeah, but no Florida, Minnesota. Anyway.
There could be a Florida, Minnesota. I mean,
there might be.
Looked.
Yeah, you never know, actually. But speaking of Florida, that's where Sinkhole takes place. So can you give an overview of that story?
Sure. So Sinkhole it's psychological thriller. It's got a little bit of dark humor. It's also a coming of age tale, and it's a bit Southern Gothic. So the book starts out with the main character, Michelle Miller, returning home after 15 years in exile. And as we begin to find out why she's in exile, we learn it's a self-exile. And she left home because of incidents that happened when she was a kid, and what turned out to, be maybe some misperceptions about herself and about her best friends, about her family. And as she takes this long, kind of arduous drive back home from where she's been living in Atlanta, she begins to figure out her past, and we, the reader, are figuring it out along with her.
Yeah, and I like that as you're reading it, you're thinking, okay, I'm pretty sure it's going in this direction, and then you think, wait, no, now I think it might be going in this direction. And of course, I can't, I don't want to give anything away, but I like that it definitely takes a lot of different twists and turns.
And I wanted the reader to go along for the ride with Michelle and kind of have them figuring things out as she does. And she's getting confused by the past and the present.
Yeah, there's a lot that's going on, and a lot that she did not explore initially. So yeah, she's trying to unravel 15 years for herself as well. Can we talk a little bit more about Michelle and what about her as a character might resonate with readers?
Well, part of Michelle's journey is I kind of wanted to find, like, my initial idea was what happens when a teenage narcissist, we maybe can't tell what they are because they're teenagers, they're maybe going to naturally be a little bit more self-indulgent. What happens when they come in contact with someone that's very vulnerable, someone who's just beginning to find herself? And so Michelle is that person just beginning to find herself. And my hope was that, that's a little bit universal during those teen years. That trying to figure out who you are, that fragile sense of self, that the audience may understand that Michelle doesn't have it all figured out. And what I have found is that, a lot of readers had these kinds of toxic friendships, and that they did also experience that kind of abuse that happened between Michelle and our antagonist, Sissy. So I think that for certain readers, that because so many people have had those incidents and those types of friendships or relationships, that really did resonate. In some ways, I had a couple people say it was kind of jarring how much it brought back to those years.
All right, let's go ahead and take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about toxic relationships, high school friendships, how they sometimes coexist. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Davida G. Breier about her debut novel, Sinkhole. Let's return to the interview.
And even if you didn't have it to the extent that Michelle and Sissy had this very toxic relationship, there's still some things about being a teen that is universal. And I think that definitely resonates, because I kept thinking, yeah, I don't want to go back there.
Yeah. I would say that, for people who had absolutely fantastic teen years, there might not be as much that's going to be relatable, but for people for whom, the teen years were a bit of a struggle, I think there will be some identifiable moments.
Mm-hmm. And was that your initial inspiration for the story, was exploring that sort of narcissistic teen and that toxic relationship, or did you have a different inspiration for the initial story?
The initial story was really that, like, what did a teenage narcissist look like? And I mean, I've run into them, we've seen them in the media, we see them in a lot of places, and they do tend to have impact. And my question was, what would they look like as children? Because we tend to see them more often either as, we see evil young children, or we see, adults. And I just kind of was wondering, what would they look like? How would they be formed? And how would that look in that type of interpersonal dynamic? And that was really the initial inspiration. And then as the characters began to develop, the plot began to develop with them.
Did you initially decide to set it in the 80s, or did that come about as you were working through the story?
I think I decided to set it in Florida first. And then I later decided to set it in the 80s because I thought, wow, like I really want this to be kind of a claustrophobic, isolated environment. And it's very hard to be completely isolated with social media, with cell phones, and with our ability to connect and share information. In the 80s, we relied on the mail, we relied on the phone, we relied on payphones, and it enabled me to take those characters and put them in a time and a place where just trying to figure out where they belonged, if they didn't belong in a small town, was going to be revelatory for two of the characters who were trying to experience beyond their borders. But really, I needed a time and a place too where nobody had a cell phone, and it kept them more isolated. It also allowed for more manipulation.
Mm-hmm. And it was easier for a lot of the misinformation to happen because social media would have been a different platform for Michelle to find certain things out if it had taken place now.
Right. I mean, She would have, she could have gone on social media. She could have seen something. She could have gone onto a news website, different things. It would have been a different experience. And so for that, and I think too, one of the other reasons I wanted to set it in the 80s is, in recent years, we've been seeing a lot of resurgence and a lot of reimagining of the 80s. And it's a very brightly colored neon place in a lot of media. And it wasn't that for everyone. I mean, I'm sure there were people who experienced that part of the 80s, but it doesn't really look at people who were dealing with economic hardship during that time. It wasn't looking at the gay community in the 80s and what was going on with AIDS. A lot of those cul-de-sac 80s revivals tend to leave a lot of that out. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wanted to bring back some of the, synthetic brown paneling and cigarette smoke 80s that I think that get left out.
Yeah, I think a lot of those revivals tend to focus more on the day glow aspects as opposed to the brown paneling, brown flowered couch, brown shag carpet kind of settings. Yeah. Although it was nostalgic for me. My sister is the same age as Michelle, my older sister. And so thinking about her high school years and just kind of picturing some of those things with cassette tapes and Walkmans and all of those great things was fun for me as a reader.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to balance nostalgia and there's no harm in it. It's actually kind of fun at times. There were things that I had fun remembering, and even doing my research and coming across newspaper ads from Florida during the 80s and finding the names of stores that I had forgotten about since I was a kid. I mean, there are fun moments of those recollections. It's just, I just wanted a little balance.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. What other types of research did you do for the book?
I mean, I did a lot of psychological research trying to make sure that, my characters were relatively true in what they were thinking and feeling, experiencing. But I also took a trip to Loretta, and I flew into Orlando, and then I drove a couple of hours between Orlando and Loretta to get a sense of the drive that Michelle takes. My rental car did a much better job handling the heat, but I went out on an airboat to see what Lake Estapoga looked like, what it smelled like. I got to see, as much as I was hoping to portray that sense of wild Florida, I wasn't sure what would be there I guess it was 2017 I took that trip. I wasn't sure how much would be there, and I was delighted to see it really still was very much the wild Florida that I remembered more from my youth that largely got paved over from where I was growing up. So that, I got to see alligators and cattle pretty much standing side by side, that kind of thing. And I spent several hours at the Sebring Historical Society looking at yearbooks from the local schools from that time period, newspaper articles, making sure I was being true to the place. And the best thing about that trip was finding out that for almost a year, I had been mispronouncing the name of the town. And it's pronounced Loretta. I had been just reading it as Loretta, Florida. But that was, little things like that, trying to make sure that I was being respectful and honest about the place.
Mm-hmm. That's funny, because when I first read it, I was pronouncing it Loretta or Loretta. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But then when there was an explanation of the name, then I was like, that just dropped the F in Florida. I was like, no, really, it's Loretta, Florida. And so then for the rest of the book, I kept thinking that in my head.
Yeah. And it was a place I found on a map. I was just kind of cruising around going, well, I know I want to set it in Florida, but I don't know where. And I was just kind of looking, and I found this place, and it sounded slightly ridiculous as I read it, Florida. But I'm like, no, actually, it's kind of right where I want this to be. It's near a larger town. It's near this lake. And the more I researched it online and basically went up and down almost all the streets on Google Maps, trying to figure out, is this my place? And it truly was. And I enjoyed my time there.
Time for our second break, but isn't Google Maps amazing? I have a friend who, when we travel to different cities, uses Google Maps as just like, hey, what's over here? And she'll find the coolest things by just opening up Google Maps to where we are and seeing what's around that corner. I don't know. I just find it amazing, and I don't utilize it nearly enough. Let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the book, of course, and the cover art of the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Davida G. Breier about her debut novel. It's called Sinkhole. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
Speaking of the lake, the coverage image is a picture of the lake. Am I remembering correctly that you took the picture?
I did. Originally, when I was working with my publisher, the University of New Orleans Press, I was like, oh, I have a lot of images I took when I was on my research trip. I'll just send them to you so you can get a sense too, for marketing, for cover concept. And when they sent me 9 cover images. Some were more graphic. There were some that had photos, and 2 photos I recognized as mine, but there was this third, and I was like, wow, that is a perfect Florida sky. This I really like this design. It wasn't until the next morning when I got up, I went, wait a minute, did I take them? They had done such a nice job taking this bright sunny day and distorting it that I didn't even realize right away that was one of my photos. I just knew it was a Florida sky.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really cool. Back to the characters. When you write a book like this with very complex characters as they are, did you have a really good sense of those characters before you started writing? Did they evolve as you write? Was it a combination thereof?
So this was my first novel, and the only way in that I could figure out was starting to get to know the characters, because I couldn't really have them do anything until I knew who they were. And I would just spend a lot of time thinking about them. I would have them kind of just talking to each other, and just even if in my head or in snippets of dialogue. So character development was something that was a little slow going at first for me. I ended up doing things like creating playlists. Each of them had a different playlist. Sissy was listening to a lot of top 40. Morrison had a lot more punk. Michelle was kind of listening to a little bit of what she would have heard at home, and a little bit of what Sissy liked, a little bit of what Morrison liked. And so I tried to get into each of their heads by doing things like that. I created schedules for what their school days looked like. What classes were they in? What times of day? How were they doing in those classes? Another spreadsheet to kind of, list where their birthdays were and how old were they when certain life events happened. And after several months of doing things like that, their voices, I began to hear their voices, and they became more rendered, more wholly visible people. I mean, it would take a while for me to fully see them, but then as I started interacting, I began to realize more and more who they were. And for once, I finally figured out how to really harness my insomnia. when I couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, I just make them talk to each other until I couldn't take it anymore and go back to sleep.
I wonder if that would work for my husband, except he's not an author. We've got to find something to get him to sleep at night. Kind of a related question in terms of the plot, because there are so many, not misdirections, but maybe miscommunication, misconceptions, those sorts of things. Did you have to keep a list or an outline for yourself so that you made sure everything was going logically? Did you write it in order, or did you have a place that you wanted to end up? How did that work out for you?
Again, back to the spreadsheets. I had two parallel timelines, and I was trying to make sure that they balanced with each other. So I didn't necessarily write everything in order, but one thing I did do, during one of the final revisions, was I took it completely apart and read it to see, like in the 1980s timeline and then the 2001 timeline, to see if that flowed, and then I stitched it back together and to see if that flowed. So there was a lot trying to balance those twists and reveals. I think what helped was that I was constantly asking myself, because it's first person, would Michelle know that? What does Michelle believe? And making sure I was always viewing everything through her lens that becomes more and more distorted and slowly becomes clear again.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be maybe a bit of a challenge depending on how an author's brain works. But I'm always fascinated by how people keep track of everything when it's a complex storyline like this.
Spreadsheets.
Yeah.
I love spreadsheets.
Me too. You lived in Florida, so that's a bit of an autobiographical element, not in this area, but are there autobiographical elements within your writing?
Some things. I was never a competitive swimmer, but I love the water. And that was something I knew I could write about truthfully as part of Michelle's character. I also spent a huge portion of my 80s childhood watching TV on terrible aerials. So that was another piece. I have had friendships that were toxic. They were an inspiration to some degree, but they're not represented in the book per se.
Did you in fact have a crush on Harry Anderson?
I did not have a crush on Harry Anderson. I was trying to pick someone very unlikely, only to find out that several of my friends had crushes on Harry Anderson.
Oh, really?
That was kind of like, wow, I thought I was out there with that one. All right.
That's awesome. I love it.
Time for our final break of the podcast, but I really did have to ask the question about Harry Anderson because I remember watching Night Court as a kid, and I don't remember anybody that I know having a crush on him. But also, again, I was younger, so maybe if I asked my sister's friends or my sister, did you in fact have a crush on Harry Anderson of Night Court, they would say yes. I'm going to have to do an unofficial poll now, and I'll get back to you with those results if I actually ask anybody. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Davida G. Breier.
Are you working on anything new now?
I am. And I am working on another, and it's going to be set in Florida. I'm kind of following the same process, but with better tools this time, where I'm letting my characters talk to me and working on it. This time, though, I think I have a better sense of what I'm doing, and I think I have the plot figured out. I'm still figuring out all the pieces of the characters. So it's a little bit different than last time, but I'm really excited to start working on it. Like actually writing it, not just making notes.
Mm-hmm. All right. You mentioned that you've always written. What was the impetus for you to write for publication, and in this case, write fiction for publication?
I think because most of what I have written, has been essay or nonfiction, things like that over the years. And I, as I said, I do work in publishing during the day. I've always held fiction in this really high regard. Like it was going to be the thing that was going to, to me, I felt it was going to be the hardest to create a whole world and hold it together in your head. And I've read books that I knew I would never achieve anything like that. And I've read bad fiction, and I didn't necessarily want to write bad fiction either. So I put it off and I put it off. I mean, I'd wanted to write a novel since I was in my 20s. I turned 50 this year. And when I sometime, right before I turned 45, I thought, well, if I don't do this now, am I ever going to do it? Is it time? And I think I was also old enough and had both, failed enough and succeeded enough at various things I had done to say, you know what, I'm going to try this, and it can be terrible, and that'll be okay. And if it's terrible, I'll at least have tried, and I can go back to my other projects. But if it's not terrible, I'd really like to do this. And that was really what it took for me to start writing, was to say, just go do something and let it be terrible.
That actually sounds like some really good advice. Just go do something and let it be terrible. But do you have, from your own experience, do you have advice for other people who might be thinking they want to write?
And it really is. I mean, try. I was surprised. I was surprised by the process. I was surprised by what I learned. I was surprised by how much true joy I took out of the struggle of figuring out how to tell this story. And the more I became attached to my characters, the more I really enjoyed wanting to tell their story. So if someone has a story, they have these characters, they want to get them out into the world, just give it a shot. You really don't know what'll happen. I certainly didn't expect Sinkhole to even necessarily ever be published. And I think it's always worth the risk. I part of me wishes I hadn't waited so long, but part of me also thinks, no, maybe this was the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You work in publishing, so I'm sure you read a lot, but when you take time to read for yourself, what are your favorite authors or genres?
I do like mystery. I love Denise Mina. Susie Steiner was actually a nice inspiration for me. She wrote 3 books, and they were technically like police procedurals, but they weren't, because they were so character driven, and the character was flawed and funny and infuriating. And I really enjoyed, I was reading her books while I was working on mine. Attica Locke, Tom Robbins was an early love of mine, where I understood you could play with language a bit. James Lee Burke for his deep love of the South. Angie Thomas does a beautiful job with teenagers. Jonathan Evanson is another one. He writes a lot about class issues. So, and, Jane Harper is another one. She does great place-based novels.
Okay, thank you. Internet presence, website, and any social media where people can find you.
I am at davidabreier.com. It's DAVIDABREIER. A lot of vowels. Or on social media, it's you can find me all the usual places as at Leaking Ink, LEEKINGINC.
Okay, leaking LEEK. Is there a story behind that?
There is. So I've published zines for a long time. My very first zine was called Slow Leak, LEEK, and it all came from a road trip from Maryland to South Florida, in which my car continuously overheated.
Oh, no.
And I was, crawling under the car, dealing with losing coolant, all kinds of stuff, and ultimately ended up having to take the auto train home to get my car home. So some of, you asked about other autobiographical aspects of the novel. The car issues were totally autobiographical.
I completely understand that. I once drove through Texas with my heat on because my car kept overheating.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so at one point I was on that trip with my friend, and she was writing a journal or something about the trip, and she wrote that we had a slow leak, only she misspelled leak as LEEK.
Okay.
She was an English major too.
Oh, no. Sure.
And it became this in-joke that eventually just kind of became the zine that became what I ended up using online.
I was trying to make it work in my head with a leek, the vegetable, but it was not coming together. So thank you.
Yeah, it all came down. It all started with someone misspelling something in a journal in 1996.
Perfect. Well, Davida, we've talked about a few things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight at this point?
No, just, if you're looking for what I hope and have been told is an engrossing psychological thriller with a deep sense of place, I hope you'll check Sinkhole out. It's available in audio, ebook, and print.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about the book and writing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Davida for joining me for this interview. If you are interested in Sinkhole, you should definitely check it out. It's full of twists and turns. It might make you nostalgic for the 80s, or just be really, really grateful that we're not in those days any longer, especially with the darker, drearier side of the 80s that we talked about in the interview. But yeah, if you're looking for something to read, maybe over the long weekend if you have a long weekend, or just to add to your TBR list, then definitely check out the book. I also hope that you will join me for the next interview, which I will be airing on Friday of this week. So once you're all full of turkey, why don't you sit back and relax and listen to another author interview. I have returning guest Mary Kelly Ikoa this week coming back for that interview. We are talking about her it's the first book in a new series. It is called Hidden Pieces. It is set in coastal Oregon. It has a small town sheriff on a redemption arc, and I'm gonna make you tune in to the interview to hear the rest of the storyline and the discussion around Hidden Pieces. We'll also be talking about the third book in her Kelly Pruitt PI Kelly Pruitt series, which also is out. So we'll be talking about both of those books. So please join me for that episode. If you are a fan of this podcast and you have not already done so, here are a few things that would be great, that would really help out the podcast to get it out to more listeners, such as your lovely selves. First off, like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. This makes sure that you get the episodes as soon as they come out. No guessing about when they might air. Like this week, when we have an extra episode, you will get notified. Also, leave a review. Starred or written, either one works. Either one is great and is helpful. If you have something nice to say about the podcast, cool. If you have constructive criticism for the podcast, also cool. Not as thrilled about the negative reviews, but hey, anything helps to improve the podcast, right? And then also if you could follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Love hearing from listeners. Tell me what you're reading. In the meantime, and speaking of reading, if you have a long weekend coming up, I hope it is wonderful for any number of reasons, but my main hope for you is that it gives you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book or multiple good books, however many you can cram into that long weekend if you have one. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.